I also get a copy?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. So I will share the slides and a recording both after the session. All right, so hi, I am Erin Owens. I'm a professor in the Newton Gresham Library here at Sam Houston State, and my role is Scholarly Communications Librarian, which is sort of a broad umbrella under which I support faculty, staff, and students at a variety of different experience levels with different topics related to conducting original research and then publishing or otherwise disseminating the results. Tonight's session, we're going to focus on what's often called secondary analysis, that is using existing data instead of collecting new data. So a little bit of a look at our agenda. We're going to talk about kind of pros and cons of original data collection, talk about the nature of secondary analysis of existing data, evaluating data that we find, kind of the logistics of reusing someone else's data, how to read and understand it, and cite it. And then we'll be doing some search demonstrations and kind of walking through the process of finding some data and digging into it a little bit in relation to our research question. All right, so let's dive right in. Really, no matter what field we're in, much of our research is going to begin with some form of data, even though that may look very different in different disciplines. We might be running a survey, taking measurements, collecting actual physical samples or specimens, but in other fields, it might just be gathering texts to identify themes, etc. In many cases, this might look like original data collection, which does have a lot of benefits. We get exactly the data points that we want to address our research question. They're all in a familiar format. We have a full understanding of what the data points mean and how we collected them. And we know that they'll be very timely in relation to our research question. But there can also be some, I don't know if they're really cons or just challenges with original data collection. It can require a lot of time, particularly if it involves human subjects and we have to go through ethics approval processes. It can sometimes require money and then different kinds of access if we're looking at specialized populations, etc. We have to comply with different kinds of ethics and security requirements. We may find that we lack some particular knowledge or skill that we need in a certain scenario to gather that data. Or we may actually go about gathering it and then discover that we've gathered an insufficient quantity of data so that we can't really successfully complete the kind of analysis that we were hoping to do. So this is where secondary analysis can sometimes come in. We can leverage data that have been collected by other researchers who may have additional advantages, whether that's funding and access, or may simply face fewer barriers to data collection. They may simply have a different context than ours. In some cases, this data is available to us because it was collected or funded by government agencies who required that the data be shared. In other cases, it's just that the data collector chose to share that data in order to benefit their field, their research cause, preserve their data, teach and mentor. People have a lot of different reasons why they have made these data sets available. And there's a number of different ways that we could reuse existing data that we find. We could simply say, I'm going to download this data set exactly as it is. I'm simply going to ask a different research question than the original collector did and analyze it anew in light of that new question. Sometimes we may take multiple existing data sets that have some sort of an intersecting field and combine them in ways that can allow new analysis and insights. So for example, maybe we have two data sets that recorded different social or economic factors by zip code. If we can use that zip code to merge those different variables, it will allow a new kind of comparison and allow us to answer some new questions. We can also take an existing data set and then simply build onto it by also collecting new data and adding some new variables to be able to expand our analysis. So let's talk a little bit about evaluating data that we find. Um, there's a lot of stuff we might run across that's been shared on the web, but the fact that it has been publicly shared doesn't necessarily mean it is all of equivalent quality. So we want to really be sure that we're thinking critically about who collected the data, why, and how. So to the extent possible, we realize we will not always be able to find answers to all of these questions, but to the extent possible, we want to ask critical questions regarding the relevance, currency, and accuracy of the data, who collected it, who funded that collection, and for what purpose. Are there any possible risks of bias that might come along with the collector or the funder? Old studies done on tobacco is sort of one of the classic examples that when you have big tobacco companies funding studies about the safety or risk of smoking, it inherently introduces questions about bias, and we need to be sure we understand enough about the collection methods and the steps taken to know whether or not that bias would be an issue in our use. We want to really look at the completeness of the data, the extent of missing data or gaps. Sometimes that may be in the form of literal missing data points, right? Like if we think of empty cells in a spreadsheet where they simply couldn't get a particular measurement or something. But sometimes that's also about thinking through what is not included. So here are all the variables they collected. Are there key variables they didn't collect that would have made a difference? Are there key populations that were not included in the data collection? So some of that can be more challenging. It can be really challenging to see what's not there. But to the extent possible, we want to see if anything really jumps out at us as researchers who say, oh, wow, why would they skip over this factor or population or whatever that seems like it would make a big difference in the completeness of this data? We want to try and understand the data collection methods, transparency and appropriateness. In many cases, this is well described if someone has written an article about the study that collected the data, but it may not be as well documented with the data set itself. So sometimes we may be trying to go beyond the data set, look at publications that are related to it and see if we can get some of this information. And in some cases, if it really is just a lone data set with no publications, it may be a little harder to get at some of the collection methods, but we see what we can find. And then very similarly, may not be able to find it, but if they address any data quality measures like reliability and validity, we want to at least be looking for that and be able to take that into account if it's present. Finally, the last thing we really, really want to be sure that we can find on an existing data set is contact information for an accountable person. We want it to be clear, who collected it, but also how would I reach out to someone who collected it if I needed to ask questions about how did you collect variable X or how did you define variable X? If there's some aspect of this that I need to understand that's not apparent in their documentation, how would I reach out to them? And that's not always going to be possible. Obviously, sometimes people pass away, people move to another country, and we can't find new contact information. There may be reasons why that simply doesn't work out. But in general, we're hoping to at least see that someone had made a good faith effort of indicating themselves as a person who could be held accountable for the data and for any problems that might exist with it. Right. Any questions about this part before I move on?
No.
All right, excellent. All right, so getting into some logistics of reusing data. There's a couple of different levels to this. Part of it is just the technical logistics, right? What file format is the data in? Is it something that I have the software and hardware necessary to read? An Excel spreadsheet that I can definitely open in Microsoft Excel. Maybe I could open it in Google Sheets or another spreadsheet program. Is it an SPSS file? Do I have access to that? So there's that technical level. There's also more of just the sort of legal and ethical level, looking at how the data has been shared and seeing whether there's any detail about a license, a sharing agreement, any restrictions on who could use it, how, or why, and just really making sure that we understand what the creator has and has not given permission for, um, and how that fits with what we would like to be able to do with it. There's a pretty cool data sharing wizard online that'll kind of help you walk through some questions to decide if you're okay with your use of a particular data set. But also, if you have any questions or doubts, it's a great opportunity to reach out to that data set's contact person or reach out to me and request help in finding any of that licensing information, verifying interpretation of it, anything like that that helps you to feel more confident moving forward in your use. So let's take a look at what that license might look like. This is just one example. I have used the Carnegie classification data set. So when we hear talk about like R1 and R2 institutions, those designations come from the Carnegie classification system. It's a way of categorizing institutions of higher education. They make their data set publicly available on their website. And when I look down in the footer on their webpage, this is the license that is shared. This is one of the Creative Commons licenses. This is not the only way to license data, but Creative Commons is very popular. It's becoming a very common type of license to see. So it will tell me that this data is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike International License. Okay, so I know at least it has a license. I have to figure out what that license means and what that allows me to do. So when I go out and actually pull up the copy of that license to look at what it says, I love Creative Commons because they do create a very human readable version of their license that is very easy to interpret without being a lawyer. So this license tells me you are free to share, copy, redistribute. You're free to adapt, remix, transform, build upon this material under the following terms. I need to give appropriate credit to the original creator. I need to be using the material for non-commercial purposes. And if I adapt or remix or create something new that is based on this, I need to also share it under this same license so that it is openly available for others to use. I like to think of the share alike element as sort of a pay it forward. You've gotten to benefit from my free work, so you should let other people benefit from anything new that you do with my work. And then it very explicitly says at the bottom, there are no additional restrictions. So as long as I meet those 3 criteria, I can share and adapt this in any way that I would like. So that's a good example of what we might see in data licensing. The Creative Commons licenses can be as simple as just attribution. It might literally say that you can do anything with this work as long as you give me credit, and there may be no other rules. The commercial versus non-commercial restriction might be there, the share alike restriction. And then the other element you might see is non-derivative or ND, which would mean that you may use it and share it, but not create something new based on it. So no adapting it into a new derivative work. So that's a little bit more of a restrictive license. And that's why it becomes important for us to parse these pieces in relation to what I want to do with the data. If all I want to do is analyze it and run some statistical tests, I am probably good to go, even with the most restrictive Creative Commons license. But if I know that I want to use it, tear it apart, add stuff to it, rebuild it, make it into a new little Frankenstein, then I need to make sure that the appropriate pieces are in the license to allow that. All right, so before I move forward to the next part, I'm going to do just a very, very quick refresher of definitions and kind of the way that I'm going to use them. When we talk about a data set, it's one or more files with all the variables individually for all of the participants, cases, etc., in the data collection project. So this is not just the data set is not just the article with the aggregate statistics. This is actually like row by row data. Each variable is a single thing in the data set. So if we just picture an Excel spreadsheet, every individual cell or every individual column, really, the column heading tells us the variable, and then every cell is a value for that variable. Typical examples of a variable might include an answer to a survey, a vital sign, the sum of a scale measure, etc. So again, not those pre-analyzed statistics, just every individual data point collected, kind of the raw. So once we find a data set, we need to be sure that we understand how to read and understand that data, how to interpret it properly. In order to do that, it's usually not enough to just find a spreadsheet, right, or a CSV file or something similar. We're usually going to want to look for accompanying documentation. We'll be looking for things like a data dictionary, a code book, a README file. Those are probably the three most common types of files that you'll see accompanying the data set. We're going to use those documents the data dictionary will help us to verify our understanding of all the field labels and definitions. So if someone says, if someone says that they collected a length measurement, we need to see a definition of, okay, exactly how are they measuring length? From what point to what point on this object, animal, etc.? What units are they expressing that length in? So that we understand what a 10 in that field actually means. Is that 10 inches? Is that 10 centimeters? And then the code book will help us translate codes into actual data points. So we'll take a look at a couple of examples here. And I'm still going to be working with the Carnegie classification data since it is freely available. So this is one row out of the Carnegie classification spreadsheet. This is the row for Sam Houston State University. I can see each column heading. This is like each variable they collected. So I can see there's a column here called Basic 2021. And Sam Houston is apparently a 16. So in order to read that cell, the first question I need to understand is, what is Basic 2021? What does that mean? What did that mean to the collector? I need to look up the variables to understand that. So I'm going to go to the data dictionary. I'm going to look up the variable Basic 2021, and it's going to tell me that is the basic classification that was assigned to the university in the 2021 data set. Okay, so then I need to look up the code to understand the values placed in each column. What is a 16? Even though I know 16 is our basic classification, but what does a 16 translate to? So I go into the code book. I look up the variable Basic 2021, and it tells me that for this variable, a school can have a code anywhere from 0 to 33. Each of those numbers then corresponds to a meaning, an actual name of a category. So I can see there that 16 represents doctoral universities with high research activity. And so overall now I'm able to read that cell in the spreadsheet as telling me that in 2021, SHSU was Carnegie classified as a doctoral university with high research activity. But I could not have come to that meaning, that understanding, without referencing those documentation pieces with the data dictionary and the code book. All right, so I want to move towards searching for data. As we prepare to start searching for things, we want to think about sort of this process. This is not the only way that we can think about the data searching process, but this is kind of one common way of thinking about it. We're going to start by searching a data repository. I'll be showing you ICPSR in particular. When we find a data set that matches our search, we skim first like the abstract and the methods, things like that, that describe the data set overall to see if it seems like a likely candidate for the kind of information we're looking for. Then we drill down a little deeper and we look at something like the data dictionary, the code book, to see if this particular data set has variables I can work with to help address my research question. So we go one data set at a time, looking at what its variables are, to see if it might be a good fit, and then going in a little deeper, reading all of the documentation for all the variables in that study and confirming that that what looked like a fit, confirming that it is a fit by the full definition. All right, so as I said, this is only one way to search, which can differ a lot in different disciplines. Things like genomic bioinformatics are going to have a little bit of a different data search procedure, but this is a pretty comprehensive way to start. We definitely want to be sure we are searching data repositories, not just searching the web via something like Google. A web search is generally going to find a lot of summary statistics, more of that aggregated level versus finding the actual row by row, point by point individual data. If we are web searching, some of the keywords that we want to be paying attention to, though, are things like response level data or micro data. Those may appear to help distinguish an actual raw data set or cleaned data set from summary statistics. So as we get into a repository, we need to think in terms of first we're searching for a data set with a description that sounds right. Then we're searching in a data set. Our goal is to find a data set with variables that are relevant to our research question, but the variables are often going to be hidden down in the data files of the documentation. We want to remember at this stage that we really are looking for the variables, like the column headings. We don't care right now what the actual data points are. So like looking at this example on the slide, I want to look at age, PCP, last doc. I want to look at those variables. I don't care what the numbers are at this point. We want to be sure we pay close attention to the original data collector's concepts and definitions. We need to consider our goals and decide, are there any concepts in my research question or my planned analysis approach that are flexible? So I was planning to think of this concept this way and measure it like this, but this guy did it a little bit differently. Am I comfortable changing my way to match his so that I can use his data? Or where do I have a concept that for my purposes must be defined and measured a very specific way, and that might rule out some data sets I find if they don't match that. So we need to kind of figure out where our hard requirements are and where our loose requirements are. All right, so now I want to actually get into a little bit of a demonstration. Just for the purposes of this, we're going to imagine that we are researchers generally interested in the health needs of immigrants and the health values of families of immigrants. Current research question very broadly, do immigrants have difficulty in building regular engagement with healthcare providers? So we want to start out by breaking down that research question into the key pieces of information we would need to try to answer that question. So if I was imagining data that I would need, well, I need to know whether each participant is categorized as an immigrant, a citizen. I would need some status there to be able to apply the data to this question. I would also need some one or more variables that address their engagement with healthcare. So knowing their immigrant status might be a question like, are you an immigrant, or were you born in the US? Are you a US citizen? Could be phrased lots of different ways, but we're going to find something of that genre. And then something related to engagement with healthcare. We're going to be sort of browsing openly in the beginning to see what we can find. So this might be a question about how often do they go to the doctor in a year? Or do they have a designated primary care provider? How often do they go in for like routine checkups or physicals, things like that. So let's go ahead and shift my screen to my browser. All right. And the repository I'm showing here is called ICPSR, which stands for something, Inter-University Consortium of Political and Social Research, I think. This is available through our university library. This is one of the databases we provide access to. I think you can search it openly from the web, but you'll need to log in through our institution to be able to actually download the data that you find here. They consider it, via their name, they consider this to be political and social research. But what I hope you can tell, even just from looking under the search box here on their homepage, is that it covers a wide variety of topics, ranging from physical health and mental health to childcare, aging, STEM, racism, spending, nutrition. It really, really covers a wide diversity of topics. The other thing to know about this that is great is that it covers a long period of time. You can find data from over a pretty extended period of time. And they have a lot of data sets of like longitudinal studies where maybe we've done this same survey every 10 years for the past, 5 decades or something. And so in the right topic or the right area, you may be able to get a lot of depth if that's something that's useful to your research question. Okay, so I'm going to come in here and do a search. Thinking about my sample topic, I'm going to search for something like healthcare engagement. I get back some results, some suggested data sets. I also have a lot of options down the left-hand side to filter my data set, or to filter my my result set, I'm sorry, by data format, collection method, time period, all sorts of different options that I might want to look at. For our purposes today, I'm going to focus in on this health tracking household survey. It is from 2010, which is maybe a little old at this point, but for right now, we're going to take a look at this just to ask ourselves, is the health tracking household survey a possibly viable tool to get data that could address my research question? And even if the 2010 is too old, maybe I at least know to go look for more current iterations of it. So first I want to come down to the project description, just scrolling down a little. This is going to give me a summary. This is going to tell me things like who collected this data, how and when it was collected, what the purpose of collection was. So this is going to give me just a good broad overview of what this data set might address and what kind of data I'm going to find. So I want to read the summary first and make sure that it even sounds right. Once I've gotten past the title, does this still sound like a possible match? Oops. Sorry, clicked errantly there. Here we go. The next thing I can do is flip over to the next tab here, the Data and Documentation tab. This is going to tell me what files are actually available. And the first thing I can see for this particular data set is that they have two different sets of data. They have public use data and restricted use data. So I would want to look for some more information on that. Over here to the right, they have some notes about the public use and restricted use. And so I could get a little bit more information about, okay, some of this is restricted. How could I get access to that if I think I want it? But maybe for right now, I'll start out by looking at the public use. Some studies may have both. Some studies may have all public data or all restricted data. It's just going to vary depending on the content. But that gives me a sense of what's going to be available. They also have this variables tab, and I really like this one as a starting point when we're trying to get a sense of whether this data set has some variables that might address our question. So I could come in here and search for a term like immigrant or citizen, just to try to suss out if there's a variable that might address that. Search for citizen, and it's going to bring back two variables from this data set. One indicates whether they are a citizen of the United States, yes, no. The second one indicates what type of citizenship, whether it's born or naturalized. So I know, okay, well, I've at least got a little bit of data there that I could work with, parsing out born citizens, naturalized citizens, and non-citizens that would address that concept in my research question. The engagement piece might be a little harder for me to tackle by searching, right? Because there's so many different types of questions that might demonstrate engagement with healthcare services, that it may be harder to get at that with just a keyword search. So that may be where I want to actually go open the documentation and be able to browse through the variables a little more naturally. So I could use this button to download the data and documentation. You see, when I click the download button, it actually pops up some choices. So I can get the user guide that will give me more detail about how to read and understand this data set. I can get the code book that will help me translate the codes into kind of real meaning. And then I can download the data in different formats. So depending on how I prefer to work, I can get it as a SAS file, an SPSS, an ASCII file, etc. Again, kind of the variety of file types that are available might vary between different data sets, but you can always look there and see what options they give you. Now I have this code book already downloaded, so I'm going to save us the time of waiting for the download and just open this PDF. This is the code book. I think, oh, I guess this is actually the one for the restricted use data. So if I start scrolling down in the code book, the first thing it's going to give me is a listing of variables, but it notes them as a positional listing. Now, to be perfectly frank, I'm not even entirely certain what they mean by positional listing. Maybe the order in which things were asked or filled out. But I can tell from skimming this that this is going to be very hard for me to browse because they're not in an order that is logical to me as a reader. However, if I go a little further into the document, I will find an alphabetical listing of variables. This is going to be much easier for me to browse through a little bit. I'll be able to see kind of the coded name of the variable and then a description. The descriptions are not perfect in this piece. I'd probably want to go look at the user guide and see if they gave some more fully fleshed out definitions for these. But I can at least kind of scroll through here and say, okay, have they had any surgical procedures? Do they see a doctor for arthritis? Have they been contacted by a collection agency for medical bills? So I can at least start to get a little bit of a sense of what some of these variables are indicating and looking for things that jump out at me as, oh, maybe this would get at the concept in my research question. Finding a new personal doctor. There is one in here somewhere about seeing a PCP, and I don't even remember now where it was, but you get the idea. Without me spending another 20 minutes flipping through this, that we would dig through these variables, make sure we can identify some that are useful. If we do, then we go back in and download those SAS and SPSS files and actually look at the numbers. But if we dig through those variables and we say, I really just can't find the right variables or enough variables that would address my research question, then I would know that I want to go back to my search results and look for some other options. All right. So coming back to my last few slides here, I always like to address citation. If we find and use someone else's data, we want to be sure that we cite the source of it. Partly it's about giving credit, but partly it's also about, of course, pointing other researchers to where the source of this information came from. The essential components for citing a data set is really very similar to what we would do to cite a book or an article or anything else. We want to be able to indicate the person who created it, a representative title, the date, the publisher or distributor, which in most cases for data is going to be the platform that's hosting it, the repository where we find it. And then some form of an electronic location or identifier, a URL, something like that. So these are a couple of examples. I've got one in APA and one in MLA format. Again, just sort of showing that these do look very similar to citations for publications. The main difference is that right after the title, they will often include some little indicators. Like in the APA citation, we get brackets and it says data set. In the MLA, right after the title, we get parentheses and it says data file and code book. So we add in a little bit of an indicator indicating exactly what this content is, the fact that it's not just a book or an article. ICPSR is listed here as the publisher or distributor. That's the repository that was hosting the data. The second one came from the Pew Research Center's website. So Pew Research Center is both the author and the publisher. But otherwise, like I said, very, very similar to any other form of citation that we're doing. I've included a few links here for you to come back to in the slides. This is not remotely comprehensive, but this is a few ideas of repositories where you could go to look for data. UN data is United Nations data sets. Data.gov is open data from the US government. It is worth noting that that does not mean the topics are limited to US geography, because the US government does collect data pertinent to a lot of international topics. So it's not necessarily geographically limited in scope, just in terms of who collected it. The Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis has an incredible collection of economic data. There's a Texas data repository where different Texas universities have shared data sets. The Harvard Dataverse is really cool because even though Harvard hosts it and maintains it, they will allow researchers who are not affiliated with Harvard to also deposit data there. So it can be a very good data home for researchers who may not have another logical place to host their data. ICPSR, we looked at just a little bit. And then this last one, the Registry of Research Data Repositories. This one's a little different. Instead of being a repository itself where we will search for data sets, it's actually going to let us search for repositories. So if I went in there and searched for economics, it might point me towards that Federal Reserve Bank economic data. But it's a place where we can search by our topic and discover various global repositories who are likely to have data around that topic. So in addition to kind of this short list of 5 or 6 that I can suggest, it can suggest far, far more sites that you might go to then do a search for data. And then I've linked to a couple of guides that our library maintains to some other data repositories and dataset resources. Okay, just sort of an additional resource that would follow after the topic of this workshop. We've also got some resources about data wrangling. So, things like the steps like cleaning, analyzing, and visualizing data that might be useful after you've found some existing data to do secondary analysis. All right, and with that, I'm going to say thank you. I'm going to ask if you have any questions, and I'm going to invite you as well to reach out to me anytime in the future if you have questions that I can assist with. But is there anything I can answer for you today?
No, all is well with me. I wanted to leave you with the clean recording so I can wait until you stop recording.
No, there we go. I just